Yeah, well, when we think about addiction, it's a simple sort of definition that we use in medicine. And the definition is that does it cause you a tremendous amount of distress, and is it disrupting your social, occupational, your family sort of functioning? That's kind of it. I mean, so people can indulge in a behavior every day, multiple times a day, but they're handling their responsibilities and they are not distressed about this behavior. They wouldn't meet criteria for addiction. Whereas somebody could use alcohol or cocaine or some drug once a month or once a week or what have you, and then they have all of these disruptions surrounding that drug use. And they may meet criteria for addiction, whereas I could be using cocaine every day, but handling my responsibilities, I'm not distressed by it. I don't have these problems related to it. I'm not an addict, even though I'm using it every day. So addiction has to do with social disruptions and being distressed, not actual amount of use or how many times you engage in the behavior. But this sort of definition is missed upon many of people in the general population.
Live from Modern Media, you're listening to Abolition Now. My name is Dana. I'm joined in the studio by Edwin and Megan. We are your co-hosts for today's show. On this episode of Abolition Now, no more drug war, why we need to decriminalize all drugs and support harm reduction policy that upholds the basic human dignity of all people who use substances. On today's show, we'll also be asking, beyond public policy, what does it look like to do harm reduction on a community level? In other words, what practical steps can we take as individuals to prevent injury and death from substance use? Our special guest for today's show is Anaiz Ruiz, a third-year agricultural plants and soil science major, here to talk about the importance of Narcan availability and training. All that and much more coming up on this episode of Abolition Now.
Police in helicopter, a search for marijuana. Policeman in the streets, searching for cali weed. Soldiers in the field, searching for cali weed. But if you continue to burn up the herbs, we're gonna burn down the cane fields. Yes, if you continue to burn up the herbs, we're gonna burn down the cane fields. Oh, yeah.
Can't say them never did know. Age of 9, tell the government
Welcome back to Abolition Now, where we first cover critical perspectives and histories relevant to you. Second, we provide theoretical frameworks to connect today's topic to a larger and ongoing projects of global emancipation. Today on the show, drug decriminalization and harm reduction. My name is Edwin, and I'm joined in the studio by my co-hosts Dana and Megan, and our special guest, Anaiz. This 2-hour program will be broken up into 3 parts. First, introducing the basics of harm reduction and decriminalization. Second, we will deconstruct our relationship with substances and look at it from a historical, cultural, and global perspective. And finally, we will look at a practical application of harm reduction strategies that are available to us as individuals and that we should advocate here in our local community. But for now, let's start with the basics. What is harm reduction and what is its purpose?
All right, thanks, Edwin. So harm reduction, right, is a set of practical strategies. It's a way to intervene into risky behavior to mitigate the harm and damage that are caused by those risks, right? And it's based on a couple different principles, right? The first being that humans are going to take risky behavior, and we cannot stop them from doing that, right? That kind of thing is not going to go away anytime soon. People are not going to all stop using drugs immediately tomorrow. So given that fact, we should do what we can to help the most people and save the most lives. And that means meeting people where they're at, not demanding that they jump through hoops and remain abstinent and do everything that we need them to do in order for us to care about saving their lives, right? So this recognizes that individuals have a spectrum of goals, right? Whether it is using drugs more safely or reducing the amount of the drugs that they use, or complete abstinence. All of those are valid goals, and we should take people in no matter what their goal is, right? And value the value of their life, right? So it boils down to a belief in the rights of people who use substances, right? A respect for their basic human dignity, no matter what they choose to do with their lives. So it is also a recognition that people have autonomy to do what they want, and that we should still care about them regardless. So you asked what the purpose of harm reduction is, and really it's, at its most basic, to reduce the rates of death and bodily injury, right? Improvements to health and quality of life are not contingent upon people becoming abstinent. They're not contingent upon people changing their behavior. We should still want to keep them from dying, right? So at the end of the day, it's also to break down the stigma surrounding drug use and other like criminalized and socially stigmatized behaviors, which prevents people from accessing services that could save their life, right? If people feel ashamed, like they're personally responsible, and if they're not ready to get sober, that there's no reason for them to reach out for help, then they're not going to reach out for help that could potentially save their life, and then they'll never get sober because they'll be dead. So it's really saying that if your goal is abstinence, or if your goal is for people to use drugs safer, neither of those goals are feasible if people are dying, right? If people are already dead. So at the basic level, harm reduction, the purpose of it is to save people's lives, and its philosophy is that we should want to save people's lives regardless of what we think about how they're living their lives.
Yeah, that really goes with one of our core things in our show, which is like, if you care about this single issue, you need to get to the core issues, right? And in this case, it's like, why do people even do substance abuse? It's, escapism. Yeah, so it's really like core issues, want to dismantle them in order to get at, if you even want to approach the issues of harm reduction and getting people off substance abuse, if that is your goal. And to that, we can kind of talk about what is a history of the policies that have been implemented for harm reduction, and I'm sure you can talk a little more about that.
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Because how did people start to recognize that this was beneficial in the first place? It goes back to the 1980s, really through the 1970s through the 1990s, when there was the HIV epidemic, right? So in the 1980s, right, studies showed that locales and cities that had implemented syringe exchange programs and STD testing and other harm reduction programs like that had lower rates of HIV transmission and lower rates of infection and death. And so that really started the association of harm reduction with substance use and sexual health. But it's also a larger public policy approach that doesn't necessarily have to do with substance use and sexual activity, right? People are going to do things that put themselves at risk. They're not going to stop. And so we should take practical measures to reduce the incidents of injury and death that result from that. So with that definition, a lot of policies are harm reduction that we wouldn't nominally consider harm reduction, right? Seat belts, for example, right? People are going to drive in big metal boxes at 60 miles an hour, right? And we can't stop them from doing that at this point. It would be ridiculous to think that we could stop them from doing that at this point, right? So instead of doing an automobile prohibition campaign that will not work, right, and will not save lives, instead we put seatbelts in cars, right? And what's harm reduction about seatbelts is that it's not contingent upon you not driving in order for them to save your life. It's not contingent even upon you being a safe driver. You could be a dangerous driver, right? And still, wearing a seatbelt will reduce your chance of dying, right? So that is really the philosophy behind harm reduction policies, and what makes a policy harm reduction, right, is that it is not contingent upon people changing their behavior in order to improve their safety, their quality of life, and reduce their chances of dying.
Yeah, so a lot there. What I really think about, which will be kind of our next question, is kind of the differences between harm reduction and abstinence. Because we've historically have done both, like fucking prohibition, and that went about as badly as anything could have. And that's kind of what we're getting into. Don't ban cars, get safety features that will benefit people both driving and not driving. And then so I'll kind of go into why is it so controversial if it's common sense?
Yeah, this is a great question, right? Why are seatbelts so common sense, but something like safe injection sites are beyond the pale for all but the most progressive of locales, right? It comes down to what behaviors are stigmatized and what behaviors are normalized, right? So the future of harm reduction has a necessary intersection with destigmatization of substance use, of sex work, right? And the humanization of people who engage in these behaviors, right? It then also necessarily intersects with decriminalization, right? Because the people who are in most in need of harm reduction services are also the people who are criminalized, right? Who are policed and surveilled and under threat of prosecution, and that keeps them from seeking out help. It increases their level of risk, right? So advocating for harm reduction and decriminalization doesn't mean that we condone or that we want to enable harmful behavior, right? Or that we think that there's nothing that can be done about it, right? On the contrary, like, we are highly ambitious in advocating for decriminalization because we know that in order for it to be successful, we have to have a constitutive project of abolition through obsolescence. People have to have alternatives to these behaviors, right? If we don't want them to do them, right? Otherwise, it's just bailing out water from a sinking ship, right? So just as decriminalization is essential to opening up pathways to reach people with harm reduction services, right, to expand harm reduction services, likewise, on the contrary, right, a robust system of harm reduction services is necessary to create the society that is ready to decriminalize drugs, right? We have to contend with the fact that right now we're funneling everyone who is using substances into this criminal justice system as a dumping ground for the problems that we're not ready to deal with as a society, right? And so we're used to making people disappear, right? When we have a problem in society, we do this vanishing act, right? Where it's like, I don't have to think about it because the prison industrial complex can just be this dumping ground where we put people that we don't want to deal with, right? So we can't possibly take all those people that we're funneling into prisons and redirect them out into our public health and social support systems unless that infrastructure is equipped to deal with them with dignity and that we as a community are willing to accept those people with compassion. So ultimately, those two things are inseparable, decriminalization and harm reduction. One cannot happen without the other. Megan just showed up to the studio. Shout out, Megan. We have our third co-host here for the day. Why don't you go ahead and make yourself comfortable, and I'll pass it back to Edwin to talk a little bit more about his thoughts on what I've said so far.
Yeah, so again, a lot there. It's all about it's ambitious to say we don't need prisons and police because it's such a system we're used to. Most of us can't even think of a society without it. But in reality, it's not even solving the issues of why we needed prisons and police in the first place. Kind of what we talked about in our last episode with Mimi, which is like the decriminalization of sex work. Mm-hmm. It's not that we want to just decriminalize sex work. We want to dismantle the systems which push people into this industry out of free will. Of course, there are some people who want to do it anyways. That's fine. The point is that most of it comes out of necessity from our system, which does not allow people to freely pursue stuff that isn't profitable. Mm-hmm. And I think you want to get more into like what the parallels of decriminalization and kind of the stigmatization of that. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so decriminalizing substance use, like sex work, right, does not mean that we intend to do nothing about the real sources of harm that are associated with these things, right? Like addiction, like sexual exploitation, right? Actually, it's criminalization that does nothing to address these things, and in fact makes them 10 times worse, right? It's the biggest barrier that currently exists to people helping themselves and also for us helping them, right? People can't form unions and advocate for their interests as a group of people if they're afraid of prosecution so that they can't communicate with each other, right? People can't stand up for themselves and speak out when they've been abused, right? If they're afraid that they're going to get thrown in jail, right? Like, criminalization keeps people from actually having a voice, right? So if the laws that nominally exist to protect them are what end up perpetuating their vulnerability, then it's the laws that are the problem, right? And so decriminalization just makes sense, right? Not because it alone will be sufficient to address all the different forms of harm, but it'll keep people it'll allow people to advocate for themselves who are being harmed, and for us to advocate for them who are being harmed, right? It'll take away that barrier to actual change, right? So I think the point that Mimi brought up that from the last show, which was really relevant to what we're talking about here, is that in the pro-sex work movement, right, the loudest voices, like the people who are least afraid of retaliation and who can speak up and make their voices heard in the movement and feel represented in the movement, are likely disproportionately people for whom sex work is more voluntary than coerced, right? She was making the point of, like, when you look at a global perspective, right, it's typically not people who are choosing to do sex work who are doing sex work, right? And so for the pro-sex work movement to make this argument of, like, the only reason why we should decriminalize sex work is because it's harmless, is leaving out, like, this huge source of harm that does need to be dealt with, right? So this is like a bad argument for decriminalization. It's like, it's not that it's untrue, but it's like we can do way better, right? So the argument of we shouldn't criminalize things that aren't inherently harmful, although that's true, like people who are doing things in the privacy of their own home with consenting adults and who aren't hurting anybody else, like, obviously that they shouldn't be criminalized for what they're doing, right? That's a good reason, but it's not the only reason, right? And it's not the best reason, right? Because it doesn't matter if sex work or substance use is inherently harmful or not. Criminalizing it will make it 10 times worse, right? At least for poor and marginalized people, right? Because privilege and wealth is always going to be a bypass to accountability for the criminal justice system. So the people who are there to exploit the industry for a profit are always going to have more power to defend themselves. And the people who are actually there out of desperation will be the ones who get the nasty end of the stick, right? So, yeah. What are your thoughts? I don't know. Megan, did you want to jump in at all?
Yeah, a little bit. I just wanted to, I don't know, because I think a lot of it, especially with harm reduction, especially just having, prisons as far as, a way that we deal with things, I think ultimately, a lot of our points are just kind of boiled down to, compassion, true compassion for people, and not, turning it into an evil, good and evil, right? Good people don't break the law, bad people break the law, right? It's this dehumanization and othering of people that like you said, we're not ready to deal with as a society. And people do drugs because they hate their life and life sucks, and I feel like we have to approach it with compassion in the same way that, gentle parenting and everything, right? I don't know, we just have to address it as humans, because we all do things that we're not proud of or that are harming us. I don't know, I just feel like it's so similar to we had this conversation last time, but the strict parent type thing, where if you have a strict parent, it's that makes it unsafe for you to come to them when you have a real problem. You don't tell them anything, you're in more harm that way. Also, there's just but and also it's it makes kids more rebellious, right? The idea is strict parents make rebellious children, right? They're actually going to end up being more unsafe because, one, they're not educated properly on how to be safe, and also because then they just want to hide everything and whatever. The similarity is just that being harsher on someone is not going to make them better. Also, just the fact that a lot of people that go to prison end up going back to prison and end up recommitting whatever crime again, whether that be physical violence or drug offenses or whatever. It's just not a good strategy. It
doesn't fucking make sense.
It doesn't. It's literally a way to just be oh, I don't want to deal with it, get out of my face, and I'll obviously profit. Private prisons make a lot of money, literally the cornerstone of our society as our economy. So it's there's that reason for why prisons exist, but
Thank you. You always bring a fresh perspective here. But Edwin, did you want to speak on those points as well?
Yeah, I think what you guys are bringing up is the binary that our society creates, and it loves these binaries because it's such a great way of othering. Sure, there's a gender aspect, which we talked about during sex work, but in this aspect, it's if you break the law, you're bad, and that is such a easy to understand thing that people don't question when they really should, because a person who does drugs isn't a bad person, but because they broke the law, they are deemed bad, and now they don't fit into the good category, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. treating students as bad people eventually puts them in the prison pipeline. And yeah, it's like all these self-fulfilling prophecies of like, yeah, if you deny people help or if you deny them opportunity, then of course they're going to go down this route because it's the only thing they can do at this point.
Yeah, one more thing for you. Yeah,
you
hold the
go
microphone
on.
closer to you.
Okay. Also, just the fact that when people commit crimes, then they're isolated from community, society because they can't get jobs. They can't, they're pretty much ostracized because they have this label of criminal on them that makes them like fully isolated from society because of it too.
Yeah, really clear parallels between the sex work industry and substance use and like the drug, I suppose you could say, commerce, right? So I'm thinking, for me, it's bringing up the example of marijuana legalization, right? So why after we legalized marijuana, which was sold to us, by the way, Proposition 64 was sold to us as rectifying the harms of the war on drugs, right? That this money was going to be reinvested into the communities that were hit hardest, have been disenfranchised by the criminalization of marijuana. And then 5 years, here we are 5 years after legalization, and it's basically going into this, all the money, right, is going into this big slush fund that local governments then use to basically increase their police budgets. And they need to increase their police budgets because now they've created this two-tiered legal and black market marijuana industry that they have to police even harder, because now they have the backing of these cannabis corporations to be like, okay, stomp out the rest of the black market so that we can only have this legalized market, right? Meanwhile, like the fact that there is a legalized system means that the process for getting a license, getting capital to start your business is such to the extent that it privileges large corporations over small growers, right? So people who are small-time businesses can't even compete in this legalized market because of how many barriers to entry there are, right? So essentially what you have is not decriminalization, which would have been what was necessary to rectify the harms of the war on drugs, but a two-tiered system of more criminalization and then a privileged system of legalization that is taken advantage of by venture capital, right? So this goes back to what I was saying in the last point about how we shouldn't criminalize things that aren't inherently harmful being a bad argument, because this is what it leads to. It leads to a system of legalization without decriminalization, right? Because it's decriminalizing the commodity, but not the communities, right? What we really need to be doing is, like, Megan and Edwin were saying, is thinking about the people who end up interpolated into this system of criminalization, that they become imbued with this label. It's not just about the substance or the act of doing sex work in and of itself. It's that we then take people and label them as criminals, and that follows them around for the rest of their lives and makes it very difficult, makes them more vulnerable, right? And ultimately creates more suffering, when the whole reason we intervened in the situation itself is because we sensed rightly that there was a source of suffering somewhere in that equation. But yeah, it certainly doesn't help to take the people who are actually suffering the most and make them ostracized from society. Anything else you'd like to add to that, Edwin?
No, but you are perfectly leading us into the next question, because like we talked about, policies are changing, weed's now legal, but what is the philosophy behind these policies, and is it true to our philosophy of harm reduction? And we kind of want to talk about the reality versus what we wanted, and kind of how it's been used against us, really, with, like you mentioned, increased police budgets.
Yeah, so the question is, right, how can you tell a policy that is true to harm reduction and decriminalization from a policy that was like Prop 64, which was definitely advertised as this type of policy, but in reality ended up funneling more money to venture capital, profit margins, and to the ballooning police budgets? So I think the thing that distinguishes harm reduction from other policies is that it doesn't demand that people jump through a bunch of hoops in order to reduce suffering and save lives. Really, the reduction of suffering and saving lives is the priority, more than changing people's behaviors, right? So just like seatbelts don't require people to stop driving in order to reduce their risk of death from a car accident, right? Harm reduction for substance use doesn't require people to stop using drugs, right, in order to stop things like overdose and infectious diseases, right? So, and then we could look at other things like, distributing condoms, free STD testings, right? The benefit to individuals from programs like these is not contingent upon their ability to abstain, right? Harm reduction is premised on the idea that the value of a person's life, the value of their health and well-being, is not lessened by the fact that they are engaging in a behavior that is risky, whether that's normalized, like driving, or if it's stigmatized, like substance use or sex work, right? So the distinction between harm reduction and other approaches to public safety comes down to priorities, right? If there are things that we can do to keep people from getting injured and killed, then we should do that, right? Like you said, requiring abstinence would only create a tiered system, right, where people who can't or won't abstain are rendered less deserving, right? Or with criminalization rendered simply disposable, right? So if our goal isn't to just arbitrarily filter out people into deserving and disposable, worthy and unworthy, right, then harm reduction is actually in no way in contradiction with the goal of abstinence. Like, even if you're, I mean, like, that's not my goal, but if that's your goal, if your goal is really to get people to stop using drugs completely, to stop doing sex work completely, if that's your goal, then how are you going to do that if people are, like, dead of HIV, dead of overdose, before you can get them to make that decision? You have to treat people like they're human beings with autonomy who can make their own decisions, right? Before you can expect them to make the decision that you want them to make, right? So forcing their hand, right, and just adding more punishment to what is already like a highly consequential and risky behavior just doesn't make sense, right? So accepting that people will not want to choose abstinence, at least not right now, right? But their lives still have value, right? Is in alignment with, even with people who nominally like want abstinence as an ultimate goal.
Yeah, it's also just like an interesting parallel if you compare it to like other positions they have on their political beliefs, because like religion, it's hardcore. You can't. They don't want you, like, they don't want to ban it even if it's, like, harmful to others. Same with guns. Like, they'll take these positions or on abortion that are more harmful to the general good or the general public because it's just aligned with their beliefs. But they can't view the same with drugs, or they don't even see the parallels between alcohol and drugs, which we'll get into later. But it's just interesting to point out. So I'll move on to our next question, which is, it seems that there's a particular need for us to be discerning in this way. Now that there are widespread recognitions of the scale of the opioid epidemic, which is spurring local, state, and even federal governments into action, is there any risk this newly found recognition of need for more intervention will not be over policed and the opposite of what we wanted?
Yeah, because there's a disconnect, right, between how we view substance use on an individual level and how we view it on a sociological level. Like on a micro level versus a macro level, it is completely different, and almost you have to do some kind of mind tricks to be able to see the connection, right? Because on a macro level, we can recognize the value of 1 million lives saved, right? That's a W, right? If we could save 1 million lives by having safe injection sites in every city, right? We would want to do that. On a macro, sociological level, that makes sense to us, right? But if you look at on a micro level, it's harder to see harm reduction as saving lives, because then it seems like we're enabling people to continue using, right? We're not doing anything to stop them, right? Somebody should do something, right? And so it's really hard to be able to see the problem on both levels, right? Because social stigma and shame is so heavy with substance use that as soon as we get to the individual level, we want to do this moralistic stick and carrot thing, as opposed to just seeing it as a question of what's going to save this person's life, right? Ultimately, that just keeps people in isolation. It keeps them afraid to reach out, right? And it keeps them from accessing services that could save their lives, right? Yeah, it's ironic, isn't it? Right? Because usually it's the opposite, right?
Yeah, it usually is the opposite. With other social issues, homelessness, for example. Pretty much everyone has heard on the news about the rising number of people who are homeless or housing insecure, but there's much more likely that the person will actually be invested in the issue if they know someone personally who is homeless, because it humanizes and brings down to earth what would otherwise be a mind-boggling large-scale problem. It puts a human face on what would otherwise be another depressing statistic. The urgency above all preventing suffering and death is more obvious on a personal level than at scale. But the substance use, it seems like it's the opposite, like you said. Like, if someone knows someone who's on substance use, they still look another way. Like, it's been demonized to such a level that you're seen as irredeemable, which is, like, very contradictory to what abstinence believers believe. Like, oh, if you go cold turkey, you can just come back to society. Sure, we'll offer no support if you make that decision, but if you do that, you can come back. Which is, like, yeah, it's just one of those parallels. Like, if you just gave the homeless person a house, they wouldn't be homeless.
Yeah.
If the addict needed help, just give them the help. But they, like, put obstacle courses, like it's some kind of circus to watch people go through, rather than giving them the help they need. And I feel like you have something to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just say one more piece, and then, like, Megan, I see you also, like, nodding and stuff, so maybe you want to give your input here too, right? But so, you know, my background is in alcohol and other drug studies. That was my lower division major. Before I transferred to CSUMB, I did my associate's degree in alcohol and other drug studies, right? And then I did, like, my internship, and I did work. Like, I worked for a couple years at a rehab after that, right? And what you find out really quickly is that, like, we're fucked as far as understanding addiction. Like, we're fucked, right? Like, society doesn't understand addiction. Even people who are in medical professions, social work professions, right? The people who you would think would be within their scope of expertise to deal with this problem. No, it was a bunch of, like, community college graduates, right? And former addicts, right? And, like, AA groups, right? Like, filling in this gap because, like, everyone sees the addict as, like, not their problem, right? For the doctor, we don't treat addiction here, right? For the social worker, we'll go to AA and NA, right? Like, I'm not an expert in addiction, right? So me, as, like, a community college graduate, right, with my associate's degree, I ended up having more expertise than, like, medical doctors and nurses and stuff in addiction, and we'd be in interdisciplinary meetings, and they'd be turning to me like, what should we do? What should we do about this person, right? Like, you're the expert, which was wild to me, right? That medical doctors don't really understand substance use, right? And, like, one example of this is, like, if you look at it as through the medical lens, right, as far as, like, the reduction in mortality rate, right? So the reduction in mortality rate for prescribing buprenorphine, which is Suboxone, otherwise known as Suboxone, for someone who presents with opioid use disorder. The reduction in mortality rate for prescribing that medication is double or triple that of the reduction in mortality rate for prescribing baby aspirin to someone who's just had a heart attack, right? You will get a medical malpractice lawsuit if you don't prescribe baby aspirin to someone who's just had a heart attack. But you can hardly find buprenorphine available in family medicine, in general practice. You have to go to a specialized doctor who has done this specialized, like, training to be able to get buprenorphine if you're an opioid user, right? So that's wild to me that, like, you can get a medical malpractice lawsuit for something that is less effective at reducing death than prescribing a harm reduction medication, a medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder, right? Addiction has multiple dimensions, right? It requires interdisciplinary treatment, right? So even if, like, doctors were fully equipped to prescribe medications for substance use, right? Our healthcare system is not equipped to deal with substance use disorder because all of these different, like, elements are siloed away from each other. You go to a specialist for this type of health. You go to a specialist for that type of health, right? I'm going to go see my therapist for this. I'm going to see my general practitioner for this, right? And so even if you're lucky enough to go to a place that has integrated medical, behavioral, social interventions, right? It still doesn't address the cultural and economic dimensions of substance use, right? The fact that what Edwin was saying is that, like, there's larger root causes that are causing these things, right? So it keeps people from seeing harm reduction as a legitimate treatment because it seems like giving up on this, like, to this fatalism, right? Of, like, people are going to use drugs and we can't possibly expect them to stop, right? And only on a sociological level is it easier to see harm reduction, not as a rejection, but as an affirmation of, like, human autonomy, that people are going to do drugs and we have to treat it on all these different levels to expect them to use their autonomy to choose something other than using substances. So I see that our webcam has disconnected, and I'm going to change the battery on our webcam, and in the meantime, I'll hand it over to Megan, who is just brimming with mm-hs and ahas, and I think you have a lot to say.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about how wild it is how deep the stigma goes as far as surrounding drug users, when really, I mean, it's just wild to me that it goes even to doctors, that they're so like, oh, I don't know, we don't do that here. Like, you have to go to a specific, like, segregated area that talks specifically about, addiction. And it's, yeah, I was gonna say something more, but I don't remember.
I mean, I can take it.
You can, yeah, and
It definitely reminds me of like an old documentary I watched, which was like really holistical and filled with bullshit, but it was because these dentists were trying to figure out why these mouth infections are getting so bad. And it's because these patients couldn't afford regular health care, but they could get dental care. And what was happening is that dentists only do like cosmetic surgeries and procedures. And what would happen is basically their gums or their bone tissue would get infected, and they could only see dentists. And because like our system kind of like sections off disciplines, these dentists could not understand that it was central nerves that they were cutting and getting wildly infected, and they just couldn't figure it out. And the documentary basically ends with like, I wonder why that is. But like, if you just get several doctors and a dentist in a room, they would quickly realize like, hey, you cut too deep, this person got this infection, let's help them. But another problem, which we kind of pointed out, is like, even if there was like a transdisciplinary solution, capitalism would not allow it because it would be too damn expensive for these people to afford. Right. And that's definitely what it's reminding me of.
Yeah. Okay. I think that we are close to 45-minute mark, which I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, because we do also need to talk about the historical and global perspective of this issue. So in order to have enough time for that, and also because I recognize that our webcam is still out and we're trying to figure that out, we're going to cut to a musical interlude, and we'll be back in just a minute. This is Abolition Now. Stay tuned.
Creep on in, on in, on in. Whoa. See, I'm riding high, high. Whoa. Kinda broke, you see me, y'all. So all I got is fire. I got fire.
Player, give me some brew and I might just chill. But I'm the type that like to light another joint like Cypress Hill. I still do be spit loogies when I puff on it. I got some bucks on it, but it ain't enough on it. Go get the S, the T-I-D-E-S. Nevertheless, I'm hella fresh, rolling joints like a cigarette. So pass it across the table like ping pong. I'm gone, beating my chest like King Kong. It's on, wrap my lips around the 40. And when it comes to getting another stogie, fools all kick in like Shinobi. Know me ain't my homie to begin with. It's too many hands to be. Probably let my friend hit bit. Unless you pull out the fat crispy $5 bill on the real before it's history. Cause fools be having them vacuum lungs. And if you let them hit it for free, you hella dumb, da-dum-dum. I come to school with a Taylor on my earlobe, avoiding all the flick teasers, skeezers and weirdos. Got me throwing off the land like where the bomb at. Give me $2, you take a puff and pass my bomb back. Suck up the dank like a Slurpee. The serious bomb will make a nigga go delirious like Eddie Murphy. I got more growing pains than Maggie, cause homies snagged me to take the dank out of the bag. Whenever I can, don't need no crutch, I'm so keyed up till the joint be burning my hand. Next time I roll it in a hamper to burn slow, so the ashes won't be burning in my hand, bruh. Hoogies get hit, but they know they got a pitch and bend. I roll a joint that's longer than your extension, cause I'll be damned if you get high off me for free. Hell no, you better bring your own split, cheap. What's up, don't babysit that? Better pass the joint. Stop hitting cause you know you got asthma. Crack the 40 open, homie, and guzzle it, cause I know the weed in my system is getting lonely. I gotta take a whiz test to my P.O. I know I feel cause I done smoked major weed, bro. And every time we with Chris, that fool rolling up a fatty. But the Tangeray straight had me. right, man. Stop at the light, man. My yesterday thing got me hung off the night train. You fade, I fake, so let's head to the east. Hit the stroll to 9-0 so we can roll big hot sheets. I wish I could fade the 8, but I'm no budget. Still rolling the 2 though, cut the same old bucket. Foggy window, soggy endo. I'm in the land getting smoke with my kinfolk. In smoke, yuck, I spray you, lay it down. Up in the OAK, the town. Homies don't play around, we down to blaze a pound. Then ease up, speed up through the ESO. Drink the VSOP up with the lemon squeeze up. And everybody's roller, I'm the roller. That's quick to fold a blunt out of a bunch of sticky doja. Hold up, suck up my weed, it's all you need, kicking feet. Cause we're IBs, we need tap like the foo-foo.
All right, everybody. So a little bit of technical difficulties today. When we came into the studio, there was no ability for us to broadcast, and so we quick set up our functionality on YouTube Live. So if you're just tuning into this show now on the school's streaming service, the first half of this show went on to YouTube Live. We were broadcasting through YouTube Live. So if you want to catch up on what we've been talking about so far, go to our YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/@abolitionist_learning. At this point in the show, we're going to switch gears. We've been talking about drug decriminalization and harm reduction. And now we're going to talk about the historical, multicultural, and global perspective of these issues, right, with special attention to how geopolitics and militarism fit into what we've been talking about so far. The war on drugs, U.S. imperialism, the CIA, narco-states, narco-guerrillas, narco-counterinsurgencies. What does all of this mean, right? Because we've been talking about substance use really from a national public policy level, and now we're going to, as we always do on this show, really expand our reach to a global perspective. So I'm really happy to have Edwin here, our global studies major extraordinaire, to talk to us about these other larger elements of what we've been talking about so far. But first, could you double check to make sure that it's coming through the audio? Coming through. Give us 1 second.
Yeah.
We'll be right back. This is Abolition Now.
Yes, boss. Yes, boss. Yes, boss. Yes, boss. Police in helicopter, a search for marijuana. Policemen in the streets, searching for cali weed. Soldiers in the field, burning the cali weed. But if you continue to burn up the herbs, we gonna burn down the cane fields. If you continue to burn up the herbs, we gonna burn down the cane fields. Soldier in the herb field, burning the cali weed. Police in helicopter.
Thank you so much for your patience. Welcome back. You're listening to Abolition Now. This program is a project of the Abolitionist and Decolonial Learning Collective. We are a radical leftist alliance of students here on campus. Our mission is to enact visions of abolitionist and decolonial learning at CSUMB. Today on the show, no more drug war. In this first segment, we talked about decriminalization and harm reduction as necessary alternatives to policing and punishment. If we are really going to take a policy approach that upholds the basic dignity and humanity of people who use substances. At this point, we're going to switch gears and take a broader look at drugs and drug use from a sociological, historical, and global perspective. As you know, if you're a regular listener of this show, we like to deconstruct concepts that we would otherwise take for granted, such as, what is a drug? So what is a drug?
Well, you've recommended me a book which really helped me on understanding what is a drug, but essentially it's anything we consume or take that can has an effect on our body, and in that it's really literally anything can be a drug. It doesn't even have to be something you ingest, as you can be addicted to, watching TV or anything like that. But to get into specifically what is a drug and what isn't, essentially, it's something that alters your brain, right? Mm-hmm. The way your brain functions, anything that can alter that for in any way you can think of, that is a drug.
So everything's a drug.
Yeah, everything's a drug.
Everything's a drug. So I think the point that Edwin's trying to make is that where you draw the line between drug and not drug is totally arbitrary, right?
Yeah.
Because every day, all the time, we're ingesting, inhaling, and otherwise absorbing substances from our environment that are interacting with the substances in our body to produce effects in our body and brain, right? And that is just like, that's so common that, like, to draw the line between this is what makes something a drug, and furthermore to say this is what makes something an illicit drug, right, or a harmful drug, right? Because, like, I drank 3 cups of coffee this morning. I'm certainly harming myself. That's completely fucking legal. Kids can do that, right? Mm-hmm. So the line that we draw between what is and is not a drug is arbitrary because foods, medicines, and intoxicants exist more on a spectrum than a binary, right? There are also many different dimensions to what effects these substances can have, which further complicates the task of trying to sort them all across one standard and furthermore one binary, right? So finally, the last point that we'd like to make here is that this is all culturally and historically contingent, right? Like, from one culture to another, from one historical period to another, and even from person to person, our ideas about our relationship with substances are socially constructed. They're norms, right? They're products of individual diversity, and they're just products of natural differences in tastes and preferences and perception and psychology, right? So, yeah, I think when we're deconstructing what is a drug, you really find that the concept of drug that isn't anything actually that exists in the world. It's what we make of it, right?
Yeah, it's like super abstract for something that we associate so much in science, and it's definitely because we lost like the roots of it just being anything and had pharma define what is a drug. But moving on to like, yeah, if it's a social construct, then an objective classification. What do you think people are like? How do you think people are determining that at all then?
Yeah, so we can look at like across different cultures and time periods to see like what commonalities there have been and also what differences and also what has changed from time period to time period and from culture to culture. So it's not just about the physical and psychological effects, it's about what these effects mean to us, right? They're contingent upon the social environment in which they take place, right? So the same exact drug, right, will mean 2 completely different things depending on if it's a spiritual ceremony, if it's a rite of passage, right? If it's to treat a medical condition, if it's simply for recreational enjoyment, right? The experience of using substances is entirely dependent on the mindset of the person using them and then the environment that they're finding themselves in, right? So the social construct of drugs is not about the substances in and of themselves, but the conditions, right? The practices and the relationships that are built around them, which is the, a view of like production and consumption that I think mirrors how we usually think about it in this show, is that we don't fetishize the commodity away from everything that it took to produce it. Instead, we're looking at the relationships and the complex like social networks that are involved in bringing that commodity to production and then also involved in distributing it among the population and consuming it, right? Same thing is true with drugs. It's just that we have this huge like criminal legal system like fucking with the whole thing, right? And so it's especially important to see this and to start to deconstruct exactly what it means to do drugs, what it means to to have drugs as part of your culture and part of your personality and part of your relationships.
Yeah, I think an important point polling there is that what used to be determined by an individual or a community or even a culture has been taken away from us. And that of itself causes plenty of identity problems, which I think we'll get a little into. But I want to kind of move on to, given that drugs really are both what we choose to make them and what others choose to make them, and given that humans have been ingesting substances all throughout history, then how has substance use evolved alongside global historical developments like colonization, genocide, slavery, and the spread of capitalism and militarism? Like we've talked about a lot on this show, how toxic these developments have been to our relationship with each other, to land, etc. So how has our relationship with substance abuse been?
Yeah, I mean, you read the book that I recommended to you, which was a book called Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna, which goes through like the history of like humans as having evolved with a relationship to the plant world, right, and to like the environment around us. Like where the individual stops and the environment begins is really super, just as fuzzy as what is and is not a drug, right? Because like we're like made out of stuff from the environment, right? Like what we take into our bodies, and like then becomes like what becomes our bodies, like is part of the environment. And so like we could not have evolved without some sort of relationship to like what we eat, what we consume, right, and have an effect on like our psychology and how our psychology developed, which is really the point of the book, right?
Yeah.
Which is to say that like we've evolved alongside plants and animals, right, and like consumed things from the world, but this has been inseparable from how the power structure in society has developed as well, right? So like if you have a patriarchal dominator style culture, right, then the types of drugs that are going to be normalized for use are going to be the types of drugs that support that power structure, right? So alcohol to numb the pain from living in this shitty society, right? Stimulants to make sure that you can work productively for the boss in this society, right? Whereas drugs that help you question your surroundings, such as psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, right? Those are going to be the ones that are criminalized, right? Because they don't, first and foremost, they get you to question your surroundings, but then second of all, they're just not productive to being a worker and being subordinate or being dominant in this logic of the patriarchal system that we live in, right? And so over time, and especially maybe you can speak about with colonization, and with the slave trade, right, and with the production of crops that were involved in the slave trade, is very much tied to this development of what drugs are normalized: coffee, tobacco, sugar, right, tea, right. It's not just that these drugs became popular, in Europe, and then that fueled the slave trade. It's that it was something about the drugs themselves and the effects that those particular drugs had over other drugs that was the reason why they in particular saw this huge economic boom.
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, the book makes the argument that the reason why certain colonies and cash crops were the ones they were because they encouraged productivity in the empire, right? Like sugar plantations, because they needed, that sugar to keep the stimulants going. And the thing is, when they first made their colonies, is that they were unable to live in the environment best suited to grow these crops. So in order to satiate their demand and to continuing this cancerous growth, they started importing slaves that could tolerate such harsh conditions and give them the stimulants that they had already been addicted to. Mm-hmm. And that's such a big issue of the book that it kind of raises. Doesn't dive into deep, but as someone who's studied extensively in Latin American politics, is something we see, especially with the drug wars as they have been ongoing, where drugs that were either the weird thing about the war on drugs is that it didn't do anything to stop drug usage. If anything, it increased and standardized the production, as we saw with cocaine, because to some extent it's something that the imperial court enjoyed but still wanted to demonize, since it was not themselves that were making it. So it was profit being made by their colonies for a drug they wanted, but they didn't want the profit to actually go to the colonized. And then you see that with weed, it being not beneficial to them. They criminalized it heavily, and only through resistance on the inside, local protests, movements to legalize weed, has it been legalized, but even then with large stipulations that it's still counterproductive to the collective.
Yeah, I think you're naturally kind of going where the next point that we had to talk about is, which is the connection between substance use and capitalism and commodification as well, and also the idea that education and knowledge is inseparable from power structures that exist in the world. That what we even know about these drugs and their effects and how to use them and safety around them is shaped by structures of power, right? So the example that came to my mind is weight loss supplements, like the MLM skinny tea scams, right? why are those scams allowed to flourish? Is because we don't have good practical drug education, or necessarily like education around nutrition and like health in schools. And so like these companies are banking on the fact that there's going to be a bunch of people who are clueless to and vulnerable and illiterate, essentially, as far as like what the effect of things that they put in their body will be, right? And so like the whole like influencer like hair vitamin shit, like I see that and I go like, wow, this is like, you know, it's not just that those people are scumbags for like preying on people, right, and like selling them a bunch of like placebo like sugar pills, right? It's that like it's pointing at a larger issue that like you know, the lack of education on the lower levels of society is like opportunities for profit. It keeps people from being able to defend themselves against swindlers. So in that, we're thinking about the relationships, right? And if we don't think intentionally about our relationship between ourselves and substances, ourselves and food, ourselves and the things we put in our bodies, if we aren't thinking intentionally about that and putting value on that in terms of our education, then corporations and hucksters and scams will do that thinking for us. So you had raised the question when we were planning about like the idea of like who gets to be an expert, which is like something that we've talked about a lot on this show. We talked about on the show with Aloe, right? We talked about a show with Mimi, right? About like who gets to create the official narrative and official like determination of like marijuana is a Schedule I substance. It's addictive and has no medical benefit. Like what expert got to decide that, right? So you want to like talk about that?
Yeah, so something that's like, oh, you might walk away from this and say like, oh, but like, I mean, I take sugar and sure, it's not healthy for me, but it's not harming anyone. And that is the byproduct of us being alienated from the means of production. The thing is that empires have expanded these core trades, these crops, because it's to maintain this power structure. And it's been that way historically. Like we've written down examples of the British Empire and the opioid trade, and you know, the rise of opioids again. And it's just this recycling, this cycle that's comes and goes of like a country brings in a crop, says it's good in this way, then doubles back, says it's the devil's lettuce, and then starts demonizing it because they see it as such an effective way to control populations. Like if they're addicted to this stuff because it's the only way they can be productive, to earn money, to barely make it by, then they can't really just be not addicted, so they just criminalize it, and now they have a reason to over-police that even the population would agree to, like, because, oh, they're addicts. It's not because I'm a person of color, it's because they're addicted. And it was an entire psyop that we now know of because of declassified documents, that during the civil rights era, they would funnel drugs into these marginalized communities because they couldn't get them for advocating for civil rights. But if they were using substances, they now had a reason to raid their headquarters, their rallies, to ensure that they weren't being productive because they had criminalized a plant. That really just makes you feel more relaxed.
Yeah. So we talked about before, like the expansion of militarism and the war on drugs. It you know, everything that you've mentioned, but also that like after the Cold War, right? Like like drugs not only are stigmatized on the individual level, but like on a geopolitical level, they become the boogeyman, right? When there's nothing else to make a boogeyman out of, right? So when the Cold War ended, right, and you couldn't just like say we're fighting the communists anymore because the big communist threat had been eliminated, right? Instead, like these like narco terrorists, right, or like the drug lords and the cartels become the big bad guy, the scary boogeyman, right? That is the justification for U.S. militarism around the globe, right? So it like takes the place of the communists as like legitimizing all of our, you know, we need more drones and planes and surveillance, particularly surveillance, right? To go around to these countries. And some of the tactics that the U.S. has used to subordinate countries are like, we're going to eradicate the crops, right? We're going to burn the fields, as we heard in the song that we played in the interlude. The police and helicopters, right, are burning the marijuana in the fields, right? So the idea is like we can go to the coca fields, we can go to the marijuana fields, right? And we'll just do a Vietnam like Agent Orange, right? We'll just like keep them from growing the crops, right? That like become the drugs. What this ends up doing is devastating rural communities because, you know, do you really trust the U.S. military to be discerning as far as what crop fields they're destroying? Like, are they going to really check and make sure it's opium poppies and not something that people need to survive? No, it's like more bombs, more guns. It like all like feeds into the same war machine, right? And so you get a population that is more supportive of insurgents, right? And more supportive of, you know, groups like the Taliban, right, or the narco-terrorists, right, or Pablo Escobar, right, because he's the good guy if you compare him to the U.S. like imperialist like war machine. Like anyone, even Pablo Escobar would look good compared to that, right? Which is why, you know, I don't know if our audience has seen the show Narcos, but like on Narcos, you can't help but root for Pablo Escobar. And you're like, this guy's a fucking maniac and he's murdered a bunch of people, but I still like him better than the DEA agents. You know, and so what this, you know, this is basically, like you had said in a previous show, they've created a monster that now they can't contain, right? So like even like this war on drugs has created this like situation that is now more out of control than like even the people who created it intended, right?
Yeah.
So we end up seeing things like you had mentioned opium, right? Like Afghanistan is the world's largest producer of the opium poppy, right? And if you look at like the way that the U.S. foreign policy has worked in regards to the Taliban, it's been always around like, well, the opium poppy should people be allowed to grow it and make a profit off of it, and like oftentimes this is the only way for like poor rural farmers to make a decent living, right, is to grow opium poppies. So right, who is supporting their ability to grow this poppy is going to be more favorable to the population. And so yeah, it's just a big fucking mess, to be honest.
Yeah, it is a super big mess, and honestly at the end of the day it is consumerism to blame, because the farmer does not grow an inedible plant because he doesn't want to. It's because they need to make money to feed their family, which is ironic for a farmer to be doing, right? Having to grow weed or opioids to feed his family because the government has made it so in a way that he cannot grow his own food and must grow cash crops for the imperial core.
Yeah. Is there anything else, Megan, that you wanted to add to this section, or Edwin? Because Anaiz just showed up, and we're gonna set up for the last part of our show, our segment 3, about harm reduction practical strategies and Narcan. But before we go, I guess to recap, we've been talking about, first we talked about the philosophy of harm reduction, and then we talked about the war on drugs, and we talked about a global perspective on the war on drugs, and really about the need for a change in stance to, instead of seeing demonizing and dehumanizing and stigmatizing substance use and all of the behaviors surrounded with it, to look at the human component, you look at the relational component, and look at it all with compassion too. Is there anything else that you'd add?
No.
There is one last aspect of the book he recommended me, which although it's kind of like he definitely goes crazy, like trying to find the drug that brought human evolution. He brings up the point that if we look at substance use at a historical lens, we can really understand that it's largely been to our benefit than a harm to our society. And he mentions chimps chewing on leaves to be antibiotics, and that is the relationship we have historically had with our ecology. And it was only bastardized by pharmaceuticals, making pure versions of these substances. And now we have entire drug wars because they had synthesized something that never should have existed for the sake of profits.
Yeah, like these are like ancient, like indigenous ways of healing, and like now we're going to like make it extremely addictive so they can be extremely profitable. Like what could be more like colonialist than that? Yeah, so yeah, I think that's, again, the book that Edwin is talking about is called Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna. I highly recommend that book for anyone who's interested in the intersection between biology, evolution, right, but then also like politics, and like there's so many aspects to substance use, right? It's cultural, it's physiological, it's like interpersonal, like there's so many ways that you can analyze it. And so I just I find it to be a topic that like more people should should be interested in, especially given like the huge epidemic of overdose deaths that we're currently experiencing. It would help us all. It would make us all a safer society if more people knew more had more practical drug education, which is part of what we will be getting into on the next segment. In the final segment, we're going to bring it back into a local context. We'll be inviting our special guest, Anaiz, to educate us on the importance of Narcan training and the accessibility for our campus community. We'll also be discussing other practical strategies that you can use to reduce the risk of harm and overdose if you or someone you know is currently partaking in substance use. But first, we're going to take a short break. Stay tuned. This is Abolition Now.
I'm on the border of Bolivia, working for pennies, treated like a slave. The coca fields have to be ready. The spirit of my people is starving, broken and sweaty, dreaming about revolution, looking at my machete. But the workload is too heavy to rise up in arms, and if I ran away, I know they'd probably murder my moms. So I pray to Jesucristo when I go to the mission, process the cocaine paste and play my position.
Okay, listen, Juan Valdez, just get me my product before we chop off your hands for workers' misconduct. I got the power to shoot a copper and not get charged, and it would be sad to see your family in front of a firing squad. So to feed your kids, I need these bricks, 40 tons in total, let me test it indeed. Shit, this is good, pass me a tissue, and don't worry about them, I paid off the official.
Yo, it don't come as a challenge, I'm the son of some of the foulest, elected by my people, the only one on the ballot, born and bred to consort with feds. I laugh at fate and assassinate my predecessor to have his place in a third world fashion state. Lock the nation with 90% of the wealth and 10% of the population. A Central Intelligence Agency takes weight faithfully. The finest type of China white and cocaine you'll see.
Honey, I'm home. Never mind when your bank account suddenly grown. It's funny, we're so out of this debt for this money we owe with ya. When have I told you that I had two governments overthrown to keep our son enrolled in a private school and to keep our tummy swollen? Come on, our fucking home was built on a foundation of bloody throats, the hungry stolen of their souls. Of course this country's running coke. I took a stunning oath to hush the ones who know. The CIA conducts the flow for these young hustlers that lust for dough.
I go work in the hood, hit my connect. That's what's really good, and supply work to the hood. These suits fucking crack me up, scrutinized like we inferior, petrified when we meet in my area. My dudes will shoot till I say so. You got the loot, give me the yay like Ice Cube, so don't play with my yayo. We won't stop you bastards, my street scramblers, chop it and bag it.
Taking pictures and tapping phones, debating snitches and cracking codes. Fast to cuff or blast the foe on any hustler stacking dough. Just pump the crack or blow. And my overtime is where your taxes go. Or gain your trust, get you to hand wait to us, cause we paid up front on the low with cameras taping ya. Getting pop or wait, the prison sentence is doomed. Make the collar to leave with 2 keys
out the evidence room with my fame. Truck, boat, or plane, they watching you. You think you got work? They copping too. We control blocks. They lock countries and own companies. We had nice cars and sneaker money. Now there's players out there talking about they holding with bugs in their house like they down south with windows open. Your dough ain't long, you wrong, you take shorts and soon. Feds will be up in your mouth like forks and spoons. So enjoy the rush, live plush off coke bread. Soon you'll be in a cell with me like Jenny Lopez. In the school I was a bully, now life is fully a joke. I keep afloat on a boat for Peruvian coke. Players do favors for governors and tax makers. Fat Quakers smoke crack and sex acts with bad mayors. The walls got ears, you big mouths probably scared, not prepared to do years like Javier. The story just told is an example of the path that drugs take on their way to every neighborhood in every state in this country. It's a lot deeper than the niggas on your block. So when they point the finger at you, brother man, this is what you gotta tell them.
I'm not guilty.
Welcome back. You are listening to Abolition Now. This program is a project of the Abolitionist and Decolonial Learning Collective, an alliance of students here on campus who are committed to the abolition of all forms of state violence and the liberation of all colonized people. Today on the show, we're talking all about substance use, harm reduction, and decriminalization. Now that we've taken a broad view of these issues, we're going to zoom in on the practical level of applying harm reduction strategies for the benefit of ourselves and our communities. At this point in the show, we'd like to welcome our special guest, Anaiz Ruiz. Anaiz is a third-year agricultural plants and soil science major. We met last semester through the housing protests that happened here on campus. And then she also posts drug safety tips on MyRaft. And it's always great to find another person who's advocating for harm reduction. So we invited her today specifically to talk about Narcan training and accessibility, but also just to talk about the tips for drug safety in general and anything that would be relevant to the topic of today's show.
All right. So first of all, welcome, Anaiz, and feel free to introduce yourself and how you got introduced to harm reduction, what your stake is in it, and what you hope to share with the audience today.
Thank you. So I grew up in San Bernardino. San Bernardino is known for having a large population of people who use substances. Unfortunately, in our county, that typically means that they're going to be homeless. When I looked at the numbers of people who actually go seek treatment, the numbers were not representative of the whole population. Most of the people that do go seek treatment tended to be white, while you had 38% that were Latino and you had 9% that were black. So there's kind of there's an issue, but again, it's not representative. So that's kind of how I got into it. It's, watching your community suffer like that and just being surrounded by it every day and it just kind of becoming the norm is not normal. It's so scary to see that everyone just walks by people who are under substance abuse and completely ignore them. There have been so many times where I'd be driving down the street and there'd be someone passed out on the sidewalk. And it's like, well, what do? Do you go check on them? And if you do go check on them, what else can you do? Because normally in that area, if you call anyone to come help you, be it the police, be it ambulances, it takes 30 to 45 minutes. By then, lives are lost, right? And on top of that, you have, sometimes they don't come out at all. I remember how many times I personally had called them for help and they never showed up. So I think that brings an important point. It's, we have to take care of our communities. We have to find ways to end drug overdose, not necessarily trying to stop the substance abuse, because that's not gonna, you can't stop people from doing it. They're gonna have access to it, especially in a place like that where people are trying to make extra money, to feed their families. So you're kind of stuck in this middle place, but we have solutions like Narcan. And Narcan is accessible to everyone in California for free, which is amazing. I found it through a really funny way, actually. I was on Instagram, and if anyone follows Insomniac or goes to raves, you'll just see it posted. Pasquale Rotella is he's an advocate for, making sure everyone is safe at the events. And he posted, hey, everyone can carry Narcan at the events now, because you go around the rave sometimes and you see people who are passed out, and they do have people who go around checking on everyone, but if you have more eyes out there who can help with the situation, even better. So immediately I went, after I found out, I was like, cool, let me go get Narcan. And not specifically for raves, but for my own family. In the past year, there's been about 16 deaths that happened to children due to fentanyl overdose. There's this thing called rainbow fentanyl that unfortunately looks really similar to candy. So, if a kid sees it, they're not going to know any better. And, if you have parents who are under, the influence, they might not be as aware. So, unfortunately, these children are getting their hands on it, and they're taking it without knowing educators are watching as, these children are, dying in front of their eyes. And those 16 deaths could have been avoided had it been for fentanyl. The great thing about fentanyl and why we're able to carry it now is you can give it to people nasally, almost like you would if anyone has allergies. You kind of inject an antihistamine through your nose, and it's kind of the same delivery. So just considering that it could be your sister, your brother, your sibling, your parent, anyone could overdose on anything, and unfortunately a lot of the cases have been fentanyl. And it's not, when I think about fentanyl and who's using it or who accidentally uses it, it doesn't just stop with children of people who are having substance abuse. It goes all the way up to military. I don't know if any of you heard, but there was, I believe they might have been Air Force people. It was about 12 of them. They had all gotten their hands on cocaine. The cocaine was not tested beforehand, which is what End Overdoses mission is also as well, like being able to test drugs before you take them. They had not tested them, and you can just hear on the recording this person who is just screaming because everybody's falling to their deaths and they don't know what to do. By the time the ambulance got there, they were done. So, Narcan is great, once it happens, but also, testing your drugs is great. And these are all accessible to us online. You can go onto endoverdose.com. You can get trained for it. You get a certification. You get a kit in the mail, and you can also order strips. I believe you do have to pay for the strips, but these are all things that can help avoid death. Narcan can bring people back to life immediately. I mean, you still need to go and, call ambulance, get them medical care to make sure everything is okay, but that's a step in the right direction, I think.
Yeah, so much good stuff that you've shared. I want to go back and pick out a couple parts that I think are really important and really central to what we've been talking about, which is that what you said about like how we as a community need to take care of each other, right? Because like we have been waiting around for pragmatic drug education. We've been waiting around for like realistic drug policy that like honors people's humanity as opposed to just throwing them in cages, and it's just not going to happen, right? So given the fact that like there's so many bigger structures that we can't change, we need to start looking at like what we can do from like a grassroots level to like start creating a positive change and like reduce people's suffering and death, right? And you named a bunch of really good examples of like testing your drugs and like how that came out of like the rave scene. And like, so my background is in alcohol and other drug studies. That was my lower division major. And like one of the professors that I really respected came from San Francisco and like cut her teeth during like the time when this was like the rave scene was like the epicenter of people doing rudimentary harm reduction, of like saying like, okay, we're going to go around and make sure people are hydrated, make sure people like have aren't overheating, right? We're going to offer drug testing and stuff like that. And what was heartbreaking about that history is that like the police would often go in and shut down the people doing harm reduction, right? Because they say you're enabling people to do more drugs. It's like, are you fucking kidding me, right? Like these are the people saving people's lives. You guys are not helping, and so yeah. So I know that like there's like a big connection between harm reduction and like the rave scene, and I think there's a reason why is because like with harm reduction, it's really looking at the relationships as opposed to like demonizing the individuals. And like obviously the rave scene is like part like a community. It's a community, right? And so we see this like community coming together to support each other, whereas usually substance use is very isolating, and like people don't have really a community unless they're like using with others, and it can be super like you can feel like you have no one to help you, right? Yeah. Anything else you'd like to add before we move on to like some practical stuff? Because I think your story is like amazing, and I'm like I really think you're a cool person for like posting that stuff on My Raft. Like that's how I thought to invite you, is because I saw like on Halloween you were posting like, oh, test your drugs if you're doing drugs on Halloween. I was like, you know, she gets it, you know.
Yeah. I you know, who wants to do that to, you know, their family, you know? You overdose while you're having fun. I don't. Keep yourself, keep your friends safe, you know? Just come on, guys. It takes 20 minutes tops to do the course, and it takes about a week to get the kit. I mean, there's a lot of good benefits to it. At the end of the day, I don't think anyone is enabling anybody. People are going to do it regardless of what we say. And, you know, be it street drugs, be it pharmaceuticals, whatever it is, do it safely.
Yeah, and I really like that, you know, you're trying to educate others too, because like this is also something that we're not going to wait around for, is like for the education in our schools to be something better than just say no. Like, you know, that was still what I was getting in my school when I went through school, was like the like cop would come in with like the suitcase full of drugs and be like,
oh my
like
God.
This,
Oh my God.
Who doesn't like dare?
They were literally daring us to do them.
Yeah, right? Like, look at all the options you have.
Wow, drugs sound badass.
Exactly.
Red Ribbon Weeks have been proven to not be as effective, especially if you're going up in an area that, you know, isn't really pushing for mental health, which I think is like the biggest thing. Everyone's looking for an escape instead of, you know, be given the tools to deal with how you process your emotions, how you process your trauma. It all goes hand in hand. They're not going to give us the resources to work on our mental health. So people look for an escape. And, you know, that's true for drinking as well.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, before you came on the show, we were talking about like the kind of double standard between like alcohol and tobacco and stuff, like things that are legalized versus things that are not. And like, when you're looking at like the root causes of like why people use drugs in the first place, instead of just the fact that they've used them, right? Then you have to really, it's like almost a more ambitious project than if we were to like really have the goal of like eradicating all drug use. Like to actually have to deal with those larger problems is not to, you know, say that we're going to like let people do drugs and enable people, right? No, it's actually way more ambitious when you think about it, because if we're not going to target the drug use itself, then we have to target the root causes, and that's like a lot bigger like reckoning than we were like currently able or willing to deal with, right? So it's not just like so it's like how can we deal with the root causes, but then also like accepting the fact that you can tell people to just say no, but like people are going to say yes, and then like what do they do then? Like the education stops there, right? So that's where I think that like this like community education and like community like awareness raising can really help, right? Because like for the people who do say yes, like they are completely unequipped to deal with. In fact, it's worse because there's this like urban legend type kind of misinformation surrounding drugs that can actually do more harm than good, right? So I don't know if you'd like to at this point like talk about some like practical tips and stuff, you know, like if we're like going out into the community and educating people. Like I taught a drug education class for a couple of years when I worked at a rehab, and like it's kind of hard to do drug education because like you can't assume that everyone's drug use is the same, that people use drugs for the same types of drugs, right? But you can look at like the common risks of like what reliably will produce injury and death, and then target those things, right? So for example, like when I would teach my drug education class, instead of like talking about drug by drug, I would look at like how are you getting the drug into your body, because that can be the source of a lot of harm, right? Like the actual IV use, right? The actual like smoking, oftentimes it's like how you get the drug into your bloodstream is like where a lot of the risk lies. So things like as simple as like not sharing like pipes or like tutors, the things that you snort with, right? The misconception is that you can only get HIV or hepatitis from sharing needles. If you are bleeding a little bit in your nose, if you have a chapped lip, right, that is a source of blood that they can then be transmitted to someone else who is using that. So like any sharing of any paraphernalia, I would say, is like the number one tip that I gave people. don't share any paraphernalia if you possibly can, right? Like, because there's always the potential for like blood to blood contact, especially if you're like putting stuff in your mouth, like putting stuff, you know, in various orifices, right? There's like a chance that like mucous membrane is going to be like infected, right? Same thing with like ingestion, right? This isn't like something that we typically think of as a dangerous way to do drugs. Take like swallowing something or drinking alcohol. But the problem is that, like, if you have stomach problems, right, or if you have a sensitive stomach, right, then this can actually lead to a lot of complications that could eventually lead to death, right? Like, if you are nauseated, right, but you're also like on a depressant that reduces your gag reflex, right? Then if you throw up, but then, I'm sorry to get very gross, but like if you throw up, right, but then you don't have your like nervous system is depressed to the point that you don't have any gag reflex anymore, that you can choke on and you can, you know, suffocate on your own puke, essentially. That's really gross, but that's like a huge problem.
It's the reality.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, right? And so it's not just IV use. Like, any kind of way that you get the drug into your body has risks, right? And so to think about like you know, common sense things that you can do that aren't going to necessarily like put a huge amount of burden on you to think about, right? So, for example, taking an antiemetic medication. A lot of these are available over the counter, right? Or having adequate hydration and nutrition to the point that you're not going to get nauseated, right? Or even thinking about like your consumption of something like alcohol, which is totally normalized, like totally normalized to be a binge drinker, unfortunately, right? Alcohol is a poison, right? And so if you do that drug over and over again, you have poison going into the lining of your stomach and your intestines. What do you think that is going to do to the lining of your stomach and intestines, which is how you absorb all of the nutrients that you need to run your brain and your body, right? So thinking about like also the way that this has effects on the systems of your body, as opposed to just like, I'm going to do this drug, it's going to be bad for my whole body, right? Certain drugs are more harmful for certain organs and systems than others. So that's also like an important part of education, I think, is to look like what part of my body do I really need to be given love and care for after I do a lot of this particular drug. For alcohol, it's certainly your stomach and your intestinal lining, like because that is going to be, it's going to kill off a lot of the cells that absorb nutrients, right? And you need those nutrients to survive and be healthy. Yeah. Any other tips that you'd like to add, or before we move on?
I think if you're planning on doing drugs, do it safely with people you trust.
Yeah.
And carry Narcan. Come on, just do it. Carry the Narcan, and you don't even have to worry if something happens. You just, you know, give it to your friend, take them to the hospital.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because the next like set of tips that I wanted to get out there are like more about the relational aspect of using substances. Like, we've been talking about like the biological effects and stuff, but a lot of the risks, right, that are easy to reduce come from like how, when, and where you use the substances in relation to other people, right? So using alone is going to increase your risk of dying from an overdose than if you're around people who you can trust and who are checking up on you, right? And it's understandable that like not everyone is going to be able to access that. So there are like websites and stuff where you can like have a trip sitter, like you can access trip sitters who will like come back and check on you, right? And then only if you don't respond, well then they then take measures to try and get help for you, right? So there's like a lot of like ways that we can get around the fact that like drug use is totally stigmatized and isolating, right? As simple as not leaving the door locked, right, can be the difference between life and death, right? Paying attention to like the warnings on your OTC meds, and like letting other people know that you're taking meds, right? Letting other people know that you're carrying Narcan, right? Like the people around you and how aware they are of what drugs you're doing, your medical conditions, and like your situation is going to increase your chances of surviving if things go wrong, right? But yeah, let's get to Narcan in particular, because I know that's like what I invited you on to talk about in particular. Could you talk about like the Narcan availability on this campus? Like if CSUMB students like want to get Narcan, like how would they do that?
They would go on to endoverdose.com. You would get your online certification, and easy as watching a few videos, just like we do for class. You get some training, you learn to look for the signs of someone who might be experiencing an overdose. You learn how to use Narcan. It's very simple. Anybody can do it. And it's so simple. It's so silly how simple it is. Once you finish your course, it takes you to another page where you can order the Narcan. Again, Narcan is completely free to people in California, so we all have access to it. Just get it mailed here, get it mailed, your friend's house, wherever. It's super accessible. It comes within a week. There's also strips on there that you can buy that you can test your drugs with again. It takes 20 minutes. Just do it.
Yeah, just do it, people. And like, honestly, I'm thinking, this is really inspiring to me. I'm thinking like now with our organization ADLC that maybe this is something that we should throw our weight behind, is like try and like organize like people to actually do this, like provide incentives for people to do this, like do this as a group sometime, just so that we can all get it out of the way and we'll all have Narcan. And like, it like totally. The thing about that is it's like everything we've been talking about before with harm reduction, like it's proven to reduce the rates of mortality. So why wouldn't you do it, right? Like, we were making the point before about how like doctors will get a malpractice lawsuit if they don't prescribe baby aspirin after someone's had a heart attack. But buprenorphine, like in methadone, right? The same reduction in mortality rates, and like not every doctor even has that like to prescribe, right? So there's this like double standard with substance use, where it's like this huge reduction in mortality and like it's still not common sense. But it is common sense. So yeah, we should do it. So again, for everyone who is just tuning in now or who is unfamiliar, right, we're talking about Narcan, also known as naloxone, right? This is a medication that stops the effects of opioids, right? It's an opioid and receptor antagonist, which means it like rips off all of the like opioids from your receptors, right? Which will take you out of the effects of opioids very quickly. It's very fast acting, but then it's like also it wears off fast too, right? So there's 2 little nasal sprays per box typically, right? And you'll want to use both of those to make sure that like you're getting the full effect, right? And even if you don't know if someone is overdosing or not, but they're unconscious, they're unresponsive, right? And you don't know what exact drugs they've taken, you should still administer Narcan, right? Like California law protects people who are using Narcan in good faith because they think that someone may have overdosed, right? So you can't be prosecuted. They can't sue you for using that if you really thought that they could be overdosing. And then like obviously the benefits totally outweigh any negative that could come from it, right? It's benign, right? And really the only harm it could do is if someone is on like opioid medication for pain relief, it's going to make them feel a lot of pain if they're using opioid medication for pain relief, because it'll take away the effects of the opioid. But other than that, it's not like the potential benefit to saving their life is like a no-brainer to use it. So even if you're not 100% sure someone has experienced opioid overdose, it's best to administer Narcan. But there's also like some symptoms, like some giveaways, right, that you can look for if you're not sure. And these will be like telltale signs that someone is overdosing on opioids in particular, right? For one, the pinpoint pupils, right? So large pupils is stimulants, like cocaine, right? Pinpoint pupils, they're on an opioid, right? So if you look in their eyes, and their eyes are like, their pupils, like you can barely see them because they're so small, they're definitely on opioids, right? So if they become unconscious or unresponsive, you should definitely administer Narcan, which you should do anyways, right? But because opioids are a depressant, right, so they slow down activity in the brain and they slow down the central nervous system, it's also going to look like disorientation, losing consciousness, very sleepy, right, snoring and gurgling because it relaxes the muscles in the throat, right? Then you're going to also see like a bluish tint to the skin or on their lips and the fingers, right? And also people's body going limp, right? Slow, irregular breathing, and obviously if there's a slow, irregular pulse, that's bad news, right? and not responding to stimulus, right? So another thing that you can do is something called a noxious stimuli, which is like basically essentially checking if someone is responsive to like something that hurts, right? So one way is like pinching the earlobe or rubbing the sternum, which is this like kind of bone in the middle of your chest, right? You can rub it with 2 fingers, and typically if someone is responsive, they'll respond to that noxious stimuli. If they don't, it's like a sign that they're in an overdose situation, right? So those are some just lists of symptoms. Also, this is something that you can go online to places like the Harm Reduction Coalition website. Will have lots of pamphlets and stuff that you can print out and give to people, print out and put on your fridge, you know, to be aware of these things, so that like it's not something that people are just taken by surprise. And also a shout out to Harm Reduction Coalition of Santa Cruz, because they're the closest harm reduction coalition branch to us, I believe, and they do deliveries of things like clean syringes, alcohol pads and swabs, like gear for injecting that will be clean, and clean cottons and stuff like that. And then also Narcan too, they also distribute too, and they do home delivery. I think you have to be in Santa Cruz County, but you can just like select like a street corner in Santa Cruz, somewhere in Santa Cruz County, and they'll deliver it to you. So really cool service. I think Access Support Network in Monterey County is the one that does those types of services, syringe exchange and stuff like that. But we'll put links to the those services in our description, as well as the End Overdose would be a great resource for people to check out after this show. All right, so we have about 20 minutes left in our show. I wanted to ask about like what other harm reduction services that you guys think would make sense for us to push for at CSUMB. And you're free to jump in, because like we've been talking about Narcan in particular, but like what else do you think would be a good intervention that doesn't just rely on like punishment, like to try and get people to be safer?
Like definitely from what I'm hearing, like if it only takes 20 minutes, there's definitely like a way to just institutionalize that in a really fast manner, right? Like they make us take like 5-6 hour orientations when we first get here, and like
and
it's 90% not useful.
We have
So,
the
like,
alcohol awareness too.
Oh yeah, the alcohol awareness.
So we can, they just add it.
Yeah, they just add it.
Totally.
They
Add it
just
on
add
right next to
Totally.
it.
Yeah. Put it all together. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that like, you know, like yeah, if we have this like really long, boring orientation that like a lot of it definitely isn't necessary, then why not like spend that time giving people tips and tools that will actually save their lives? Like drug education, like practical drug education should be a part of our orientation. Yeah, so maybe that's a political cause that we'll get behind at ADLC. It would be cool to see that. Like that seems like something common sense that like everyone should get behind. Yeah. Okay. Anything else on like the practical or local level to comment on before we kind of like take another short break, and then we'll come back to wrap up the show?
I think we take a short break.
Okay. All right. Don't go away. This is Abolition Now. We're here talking about drug decriminalization and harm reduction. We'll be back in just a minute.
Hay poder, hay dinero, hay respeto, mandaderos, tintes y traquetos, pero cuando coronas la vuelta, te conviertes el duro del cuento, aquel hombre que porta una escolta y de pronto lo busca el gobierno. Hay carteles, equipos y rangos, poderosos multimillonarios, Medellín de Pablito y su gente, Escobar un hombre respetado, supo hacer deshacer al gobierno, fue violento y así fue aceptado. Las batallas que fueron ganadas, las derrotas no son olvidadas. Hay venganza, por eso hay respeto. Todo tiene la causa y efecto. Los políticos y guerrilleros se deslumbran al ver el dinero. Hasta Colombia, mi gente. Hubo guerra, traición, delincuencia, nunca se vio la pobreza. Trabajaban así los hermanos sin temer al gobierno y sus rejas. Cali fue de los más respetados, los Rodríguez formaron su empresa. Con el norte del valle presente, poderoso cartel del oriente, la virtud de la mente maestra se combina con las estrategias. Traficar es negocio asociado y los reyes son los colombianos. Hay soplones, sapos y embalados, las chimbitas siempre de mi agrado. Dijo parce, nos busca el gobierno, si nos tuercen luego nos pillamos. Más de pronto que siga este cuento, son los duros narcocolombianos.
Welcome back to Abolition Now. My name is Dana. I'm joined in the studio by my co-host Edwin and our special guest for today, Anaiz. We're talking about harm reduction and drug decriminalization, two topics that are really parallel a lot of the things that we've talked about before on this show. Given that we are an abolitionist group, we are against forms of state violence and essentially carceral solutions to social problems, right? Like, we don't think that throwing people in jail or labeling them as criminals is going to do anything to address the harm that is involved in like the behaviors that people engaged in. It'll just make them more difficult for them to seek help, and more difficult for the people who are being harmed the most, right, to stand up for themselves. So we certainly take that approach when we're talking about substance use, that like the more criminalized and stigmatized and marginalized people are, the less they can actually stand up for themselves and come together and unionize and have a voice, right? So the drug decriminalization movement has to go hand in hand with like harm reduction approaches to public policy, where if people are not going to be stigmatized for using these substances, then we do need to have like systems in place for like helping them mitigate the risks of their behavior. Otherwise, it's just going to seem like we're enabling like harm, which we're not. Like, we're trying to find productive ways of dealing with it, right? Edwin, did you want to jump in on that again?
Yeah, it would be perfect that these common sense things that we've discussed on the show today were common sense. And the thing is that as great as it would be to look at this as a single issue, that's not the case. We can look at SF, who had a needle exchange program, and then they removed it, and now they have the problem of dirty syringes on the road again, and their solution is to criminalize homelessness even more. And that's kind of the whole point of why we talk about things in a broader sense, because these issues are not isolated. You cannot solve one without solving the other. Mm-hmm. And the underlying cause is that these people are doing it in forms of escapism, or because they're in a desperate situation, and because the help has so many hurdles that they feel like just keep going is a better alternative. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we kind of talk about like it does seem like common sense, but the institutions at play do not like these solutions because they are not profitable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if what we think of as autonomy and personal responsibility is limited by the existence of these institutions, right, is limited by the fact that we live in a disciplinary carceral society and that we're all socialized into that ideology, right, as long as we focus on policing and punishing individual behavior alone, as in the case of abolition, or in getting people to stop using drugs completely, as in the case of harm reduction, we're essentially denying that there are legitimate reasons for people to break the law or to turn to substance use, right? We're essentially refusing to recognize their autonomy, right? This neuters our ability for reflection and for inquiry into what could actually be long-term solutions that would stop people from doing those behaviors in the first place, right? In regards to the philosophy of harm reduction, right, if you want to influence the behavior that people engage in, you need to treat them like they're human beings that have the ability to make their own choices in the first place. So if we didn't just have this punitive, legalistic, disciplinary system, right, and more punishment instead of actually reflection and inquiry, right, we would have to have responsibility for our fellow community members instead of just responsibility to stay obedient to the state and not get out of line, right? And that means, like, thinking harder about what kind of society we want to live in. And that's like scary. It's like something that we've never been asked to do. And that's, you know, an honestly more meaningful version of autonomy than like the autonomy to like, I am free to do whatever I want as long as I don't break the law, right? If it's like obedience to like an authority that doesn't represent our interests, that's like hardly autonomy at all. So one of my favorite Angela Davis quotes that maybe would be a good rumination to like to end on, right, is she says, crimes are expressions of unmet social needs. So here is where you can see like how a harm reduction approach to substance use is really compatible with abolition, right? We can't see substance use for the nuanced aspect of human existence that it is, the social meanings that it has, the functional purposes that it serves for people, right? The needs it fulfills, the whole good, bad, and ugly of it. If our only framework for looking at it is this dichotomy between vice and temperance. And so too with the dichotomy of law-abiding and criminal, right? We're lost to understanding the natural diversity of our affinities and needs if this normative framework is all we have to work with. And besides using these dichotomies to simplify like social realities, the line that we draw is completely arbitrary.
But who determines what that line is a fundamental argument in all of our shows. Like who determines what democracy is, who determines what freedom is, who determines what substance abuse is. And in a lot of these cases, it is still the colonized systems that we all lived under. And if we want a better world, we do need to decolonize and, you know, abolish the systems that enforce it in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. Any thoughts, Anaiz, before we wrap up?
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing. When I was looking at those numbers about the people who seeked rehab, the majority, you could just see, like, 'cause they had everything in the bars and everything was split into different colors. The majority of it was for marijuana, of all things. It come on. You know, if you punish those people who are, you know, doing something that's already been legalized, it really discourages those who are doing much more hard drugs to seek help. You know, and I think a lot of the people who are, you know, really addicted to these substances are too scared to seek help. They're too scared because of the repercussions that come with it. You're, you know, even if you say it's rehab, you're closed off in this space. You can't leave until they think you're good enough. So maybe we have to rethink rehabs as well, and how to, you know, really serve these people and actually help them, you know, change their lives, or, you know, even if they don't want to change what they're doing, just help them because they're people, not because, you know, oh, they're a valued member of society. Who cares? Just fucking help them.
Yeah, all of us or none of us. Yeah, I love it. I love it.
On the show,
okay, sorry.
Yeah, no filter. Yeah, like all of us or none of us, right? Like, are you kidding me? Yeah, I have to like pass a certain like your arbitrary. That's why I said like it's arbitrary. Like your standard for like what makes me a valuable person. Screw you. Like I'm a person. So yeah, what you said about like rehab especially like reminds me of another thing, a point that I was thinking about for this show, which is like commodification being a huge part of like how like drugs have changed since colonization, but also like how drug treatment has changed. Like that if it's not profitable, if this is not a profitable way of like treating substance use, then like screw you. Where like, so we have this like rehab industry, but then a drug like Ibogaine, right, which is, you know, like something that could treat people's addiction, but it wouldn't be as profitable as keeping them in rehab for three months, right? You know, is criminalized. It's illegal, and yeah. And then the other point that you brought up too, which is that like people think that the war on drugs was only about hard drugs, which is like a total myth. Because if you go back through the data, like the data of like who is being arrested and for what, like a good majority, like a plurality, if not a majority of the arrests during the 80s, 90s, especially in the 90s through the early 2000s, were for marijuana possession.
Looking at you, Kamala Harris.
Yeah, Kamala Harris called out. Yeah, and yeah, which makes it especially egregious that like the returns from this Prop 64 have, so much of them have been reinvested in police departments and like gone to basically like the cannabis corporation industries of like, and then there's these like breadcrumbs that they're like, okay, well, we're going to give this to localities to invest in prevention, or we're going to give this to localities to invest in, people of color who want to start cannabis businesses. That was a program in LA. But you look at the numbers of like how much money is actually going into those programs compared to how much of it's just going into like a slush fund that then becomes like money for police departments. It's really sad that like this was billed to us as like a bill that would have the same goals as decriminalization in reducing the harm done by the war on drugs, and really what it was like a corporate handout and a windfall for police departments. Sad.
Yeah.
Sad. Yeah, sad. All right, so we're almost out of time. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Abolition Now. We broadcast every Wednesday, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. right here on Otter Media. Next week, we have another exciting program lined up for you. We'll be talking about international development, debt and finance, and bringing you an update on our unproblematic fave, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, and a proposal for a currency merger between Brazil and Argentina. What's that about? That's an episode you won't want to miss. It'll be right here on Otter Media next week, February 22nd. Same time, same channel. And if you can't tune in live, we post recordings of all of our shows on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@abolitionist_learning. If you have questions or comments about today's show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic for us to cover on a future episode, you can direct your email correspondences to adlc@csumb.edu, or you can send us a DM on Instagram. Our handle there is @adlc.csumb. Thank you for joining us. Anaiz, did you have anything else that you'd like to plug, or any takeaways you'd like to leave our audience with?
Yeah. The OC3 will be hosting a bunch of events that were student created, so look out for those.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us on today's show. We will see you next week.
Our government has a firm policy not to capitulate to terrorist demands, that no concessions policy remains in force. In spite of the wildly speculative and false stories about arms for hostages and alleged ransom payments, we did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages. Nor will we.
The ballad of the bullet, some freedom or some will we ever do it big or just keep settling for look? We brag on having bread, but none of us are bakers. We all talk having greens, but none of us own acres. If none of us own acres and none of us grow wheat, then who will feed our people when our people need to eat? So it seems our people starve from lack of understanding, cause all we seem to give them is some ballin' and some dancing, and some talking about our car and imaginary mansions. We should be indicted for that we inciting, telling children deaf and pretending it's exciting. We are advertisements for agony and pain. We exploit the youth, we tell them to join the gang. We tell them dope stories, introduce them to the game. Just like Oliver North introduced us to in the 80s when them came on military plane.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages.